This is day 10 of the Sociology Guys 2022 Challenge, where I look to answer 20 marks of A-level sociology questions each weekday. This week we've been looking at theory and methods, and this is the last two questions on theory and methods that we're going to go through. I set them early this morning, and now I'm going to give the answers to the two questions that I set. So this morning I set two questions. First one was outline and explain two ethical limitations of using experiments in sociological research. Pretty straightforward question, as long as you may realise that sort of like you're talking about ethical limitations and experiments. It can be lab experiments, it can be field experiments. We're going to go through that a little bit in this video. And the second one is outline and explain two ways in which values can influence a researcher's choice of topic. A little bit more difficult. We have already done a question on values, but now we're applying it to choosing a topic. So there's a few different values you can look at. So theoretical preference, methodological preference, funding requirements, career trajectory, things like that, and how that influences a researcher's choice of topic when they're going to do some research. But again, we'll go through that as we look at the answer. So first of all, today I sent out this sheet. It looked at the ethical considerations when conducting research. Main ethical considerations you're thinking about is deception, the right to withdraw, informed consent, protection from psychological and physical harm, and the social sensitivity of an issue. You can also talk about things like confidentiality, and you can also talk about anonymity and making sure that data is stored correctly. But these were the main ones that we were looking at, and of course there's lots of experiments that have breached these, and we can use those as examples. If we look at our field experiments, one example here we've got is Pygmalion in the classroom, which was Rosenthal and Jacobson. Field experiments, the big ethical drawbacks with those is things like informed consent, particularly if people aren't aware they're taking part in an experiment. Deception, if you're not telling them the aims of the experiment, or you are giving them false information about the experiment, as happened with Rosenthal and Jacobson. They manipulated teachers' expectations to see if it would have an impact on students' performance. Lab experiments, again, big, lots of different ethical issues that we've seen with lab experiments. Milgram's obedience is one that you can use there. You can also use Zimbardo. You could use Solomon Ash's line study as well. I know they are psychological studies, but they will be credited in a sociology exam because they're often used as examples of ethical limitations, particularly in experiments. Okay, so here's my answer to the first question, which was outline and explain two ethical limitations of using experiments in sociological research. One ethical limitation of using experiments in sociological research is deception. So there you go, I've identified an ethical limitation. Now I have to explain why it is an ethical limitation. I need to explain what deception is and how experiments end up deceiving people from time to time. Both field experiments and lab experiments rely upon researchers manipulating the independent variable and measuring the dependent variable in order to see if there is a relationship between the two. In some experiments, this may mean the participants are not informed of which variable is being altered, or not informed of the true purpose of the research. So I've made the link between what deception is and how it happens in experiments. An example of this is written in Rosenthal and Jacobson's research into the halo effect, where they informed teachers that some pupils had been assessed as having the potential to bloom academically. This was not accurate, but rather a manipulation of the truth, and teachers were unaware of this. Rosenthal and Jacobson had deliberately deceived them. However, as this was necessary for the purposes of the experiment, it was allowed. Had Rosenthal and Jacobson revealed the true aims to see if teachers having high expectations improve performance, teachers may have altered their behaviour to prove or disprove the relationship, and so deception was deemed to be appropriate in this case. So what I've done is I've explained what deception is. I've explained how and why experiments may cause deception. I've given an example of how it has occurred, and what I've done here is, some people may see this as evaluation. I see it as being a little bit high order analysis and explaining why deception is sometimes necessary. I've explained that deception sometimes is needed in order to get people's true reactions. Let's look at our second paragraph. A second ethical limitation of using experiments in sociological research is protection from harm. So I've identified the limitation. One of the ethical guidelines for experiments in the social sciences is to protect participants from psychological or physical harm. Some experiments, particularly lab experiments, may cause distress to participants as they attempt to alter an individual's behaviour through manipulating variables in their environment. Whilst this is usually consensual, it can cause harm. For example, Milgram's infamous experiment as they were manipulated into delivering what they thought was a fatal shock to another participant. Whilst counselling and reassurance was given after the experiment that the participants had not caused harm to the other participant, a confederate of Milgram's, participants were concerned that they could have caused harm based on the orders of others. Furthermore, participants in the experiment showed physical signs of distress and yet were asked to continue. So here I've gone with another rate. It does seem a little bit descriptive, but what I've made sure that I've done in here is when I'm using the example, I've kept on referring to how it has caused the physical harm or the psychological harm. So that's another way in which you can look at the ethical limitations of using experiments. What I would suggest is when you do get this type of question, whether it asks for practical limitations, ethical limitations or theoretical limitations, have a couple of examples to use because it really fills out your analysis. So as you go through your studies in sociology, you will have seen different pieces of research, and it's always useful to know at least one or two pieces of research for each of the different research methods. The second question we looked at was values in sociology. Couple of values, well, 5 values I've put here, the top 5 values on the sheet that I sent out. The theoretical perspective and how that might influence the choice of a topic. So, for example, Marxists will always pick topics that are linked into class inequality. Feminists will look at gender differences in society. The nature of scientific inquiry, is this going to influence the topic? It could do, particularly if they want to be seen to be studying society more scientifically. They're less likely to look at niche groups and niche topics. They're more likely to look at broader ranging ideas that can create predictions about human behaviour. Their methodological preference, that will influence the topic. Our interpretivists tend to look at smaller scale research and therefore will pick topics that are a bit more niche. Positivists, they tend to like very broad ranging topics, so things like inequality and how that impacts on people. Career trajectories is another one, and we can look at this and sort of like say that some sociologists will pick a topic in order to advance their career. Particularly early career sociologists may have less choice over what they research. They may become part of a research partnership, and then as they become better known for their research work, they may be able to have greater choice over the topics themselves. And then data collection, the type of data that you're collecting. Qualitative data tends to be used for more sensitive topics, smaller topics, things that we need more in-depth information on. So things like domestic violence, people's experiences of the criminal justice system. Whereas more kind of surface data might be needed for things like educational achievement. So let's look at my 2 responses. First of all, it was the question is outline and explain 2 ways values can influence a researcher's choice of topic. Well, the first one I've gone with is methodological preference. I'm going to explain how a researcher's choice of methods influences their topic. So one way values can influence a researcher's choice of topic is through their methodological preference. Sociologists have different views on the role of sociology, and this is reflected in their choice of methods. Some view sociology as a science and look to adopt quantitative methods of research, seeing social behaviour as predictable. Others argue that sociology has a role to play in raising awareness of issues that others cannot, and as such prefer to examine smaller sections of society using qualitative methods. The choice of methods can influence the topic choice, as topics that require more detail, such as domestic violence, experiences of education and identity formation, would require more in-depth approaches to understand the range of issues involved. Furthermore, other topics such as inequality in the workplace between males and females may be best analysed using quantitative methods such as statistics to enable researchers to collect enough data for the findings to be reliable and push for social policies to address those issues. So the idea is the way in which they study the topic often determines the topic that they're going to study. It's almost like what came first, the chicken or the egg, but the idea is that methods and topic are very much interlinked. A second way in which values can influence a researcher's choice of topic is through their theoretical perspective. This is probably one of the easier ones to pick. For example, Marxists and feminists will look to address issues of class and gender respectively. While this can be done on a macro scale or a micro scale, the theoretical position of the researcher will look to address the issues from a critical viewpoint, examining the disadvantages faced by those from a lower social class or differences between experiences of males and females. For example, Marxists looking to examine the life chances of individuals will make comparisons between the life chances of those in different social classes, as their theoretical perspective is focused on class conflict. Additionally, feminists will select topic areas that are of concern to females or where females are facing disadvantaged positions such as employment or domestic labour. This can also be said of interactionists who look to study individuals and their concerns, leading to research of smaller groups and sociological rather than social issues, e.g. interactions within schools, how the working class negotiate the criminal justice system. Okay, so that is one way in which you can develop that theoretical viewpoint. I've given quite a few examples of what they would look for there, and I've made sure that it's been linked into their theoretical viewpoint and how it selects the topic. Okay, so we've finished with theory and methods now. So for those of you who don't do culture and identity, you get a week off. For those of you who do culture and identity, it's around about 7% of students studying at A level. I've put 2 questions up here. The first one is outline and explain 2 ways individuals are socialized into their gender identities. Okay, so that's taken from the 2 spec points there, socialization and looking at differences in gender identity and making a link between socialization and gender identity. It's quite a straightforward one. There are some more complex ones in there. The second one I've taken from the last spec point, which was on production and consumption, and I've put an item up here. Sociologists have argued that individuals often define themselves through their role in the process of production. Their ability to afford consumer goods as well as what they contribute to society form part of their identity. And then the question is, applying material from item A, analyse 2 ways in which employment forms part of an individual's identity. So there's a couple of hints there. When we're talking about employment as well, if you see a question like this, analyse 2 ways in which employment forms part of an individual's identity, you can also talk about lack of employment. Even though it's not hinted at really there in the item, you could twist some of those hooks to sort of like say inability to afford consumer goods or inability to contribute towards society and how that impacts on somebody's identity. So there's 2 different ways in which you can go with that. You can go with employment or lack of employment. Okay, so that question is set and you'll get the answers or my answers for those 2 questions on Monday the 14th of March, sometime in the evening. Hopefully, if you're doing culture and identity, you will find this week useful. I know there's not a lot of people do videos or anything like that for culture and identity. Hopefully there will be some more out there, so just kind of watch this space. Thanks for taking part.